Welcome back to Videos from the Ville. This is Professor Greenewalt, and this is Public Administration and Public Service. We're finishing our first video, which was on microeconomics, and we're going to take a look at some of the final concepts involving microeconomics. We want to look at elasticity, we want to look at public good, externalities, and then what are the appropriate cases according to the British School of Welfare Economics where government, where it makes sense for government to intervene in societal affairs. And we find, in fact, again, we go back to the basic question in public administration, and that is, what should government do? What should government do in society? When should it do it? How much of it should they do? I hope that those 7 examples will at least give you a start of something to think about. You can accept it, you can reject it, you can modify it, but I'm not going to leave you hanging in the lurch with no answer to the question of what should government do and when should they do it. Well, let's take a look for a moment at the concept of elasticity. We were looking at the concepts of supply and demand. What is elasticity? Elasticity is the relationship between the price of a good or service and the quantity demanded. It's the relationship between the price of a good or service and the quantity demanded. You find that we can have something called perfectly inelastic demand, or we can have a perfectly elastic demand. A perfectly inelastic demand is one where it doesn't matter what the price of the good or service is, the consumer is always going to demand the same amount. When does that ever happen in society? So here you, on this vertice, this axis, we would have price. On this axis, we would have quantity. And our demand curve would be straight up and down. And that would mean, that would show that we are always at the same quantity. But it's even though we're at the same quantity, it doesn't matter what the price is. We're consuming the same amount. What good or service is there that we ever deal with that would have that type of demand curve? Well, if you think about it long enough, you realize that it's only things really that have to do with life and death. For example, if you are diabetic and you need insulin to stay alive, it doesn't matter what the price of the insulin is, you're willing to pay the price or you'll lose your life. So that would be an example of a perfectly inelastic demand. This would be an HIV patient that needs the cocktail, for example. Now we have other drugs, but needs a cocktail to stay alive. It doesn't matter what the price of that drug or those drugs cost. You're going to pay that to stay alive. Another example of perfectly inelastic demand would be, for example, if you're a heroin addict or a cocaine addict. Again, it doesn't matter what the price of the heroin or the cocaine is. You'll simply stay on the streets long enough to rob enough people, steal enough hubcaps so that you have enough money to pay for that next hit of cocaine or heroin. Perfectly inelastic demand. Then we have in the case of the perfectly elastic demand, and this is simply, here is the price axis, and on the bottom is the quantity axis. And we find it from the price axis, and we find at some price level, the demand curve just goes straight across. What does that mean? That means that at that price on the price axis, whatever it might be, say it's $3, so long as the good or the service is $3 or less, we can sell as much of it as we can manufacture. If we go to $3.01, we can't sell any of it. Now, what in the world would have a demand curve that would resemble that? A demand curve that would be perfectly elastic? There's really only one good example, and That is found at Roots Market on Tuesday nights. I believe it's Tuesday. Wonderful marketplace between Mannheim and Landisville. And that would be agricultural produce, when we have fruits, fresh fruits or fresh vegetables. For example, I've gone to Roots many times with the idea that I will pay, I don't want to pay any more than $1.50 for a cantaloupe, and I won't spend any more than $3 for a watermelon. So long as I can find watermelon for $3, I'll buy as many as I can fit in the car. But if the price is $3.01, I'll go over and I'll buy a honeydew melon instead. So that is an example of a perfectly elastic demand curve. Well, this takes us on to several other principles here. Let's take a look at something called a public good. What is a public good? A public good, you'll hear this expression from time to time, and I want you to know exactly what it is. It is an expression that tends to be used and used accurately more frequently in economics than is true in political science. A public good is something that is desirable, something that is non-divisible, something that is non-excludable. It's something that's too expensive for individuals to provide for themselves. Theoretically, there's only one true public good. What do you think it might be? The one true public good, according to economists, would be national defense. National defense is desirable. It's not divisible. I can't give you so much of national defense and your neighbors so much. It's non-excludable. We all can partake of it. And it's too expensive for individuals to provide for themselves. You might be Bill Gates and you can buy a few tanks, but you can't provide a whole Army, Navy, and Air Force for yourself. So a public good, we're going to use, even though there's only one true public good, national defense, we're going to use the term in a less rigid way. We're going to use the term in a looser way, so that public goods will apply to our roadway system. See, our roadway system, we could exclude people from that, a turnpike being an example of this. The roadway system might meet all the other criteria, but we can exclude people from it. But we're not, we're going to use the phrase of public good a little bit less stringently. So we'll use the term public good to refer to concert halls, libraries, roadways, sewage treatment plants, were all examples of, for example, public goods. Now we want to move to something called an externality. What is an externality? An externality is also called a spillover. So spillovers and externalities are the same thing. And spillovers or externalities are the difference between private cost and social cost. The difference between private and social costs. And you find that spillovers can be both negative and they can be positive. They can be negative or they can be positive. An externality, and I want you to remember that definition absolutely on word for word. The difference between private and social costs. The difference between private and social costs. Let's take a look at a externality. You find that when my family moved to North Annville, we were a mile away as the crow flies from Millard limestone plant. When the lime plant was built in North Annville Township in Lebanon County, we find it was built at a place where where we have the purest limestone in the world. They have the highest concentration of calcium carbonate, I believe, that goes into the stone. It's the finest limestone in the world is right there. And so Mr. Millard built the largest lime kiln. Maybe at the time it was finished, by the time it was finished, it was the third largest lime kiln in the world. No, I'm wrong. I got this wrong. It was the largest lime kiln in the world in the 1930s when he built it. Now it's the third largest lime kiln in the world. That's what it is. I'm sorry. Well, at any rate, when he made lime, we dug up big chunks of limestone. Eventually, those chunks of limestone are crushed and processed into powder and made into lime, and then sold for various building products or for agricultural production. Well, we find when in the 1960s, before the Clean Air Act, we find that we go outside in the morning and everything would be covered with a small light film of white, and it was lime from the processing plant. The processing plant wasn't taking care of all of its effluent itself and was throwing it out for the general public to have to bear part of the production costs. And you find that the plants loved it and they had lots of lime, but the thin layer of lime would eat away paint from the cars, from the homes. It could eat away your clothing if you left it out on the clothing line overnight. So the general public was all bearing some of the cost for the production of lime at this time. You could say that lime sold for $70 a ton at that point. After the Clean Air Act was passed, you find that this effluent levels had to be decreased, and Millard Limestone had to pay the full cost of producing their product. So now, rather than being able to sell a ton of lime for $70, they could sell a ton of lime for $80. So what was happening before, when they could sell it for $70, is the product that was being made required that the public would bear $10 a ton of the cost of producing. Because originally they could sell it for $70, now they're selling it for $80. So the public was bearing that extra $10 price in the term of this, what we would say is pollution. So what is the way? Well, that's a negative externality. Pollution is a negative externality. Okay, pollution is a negative externality. We can also talk about positive externalities. A positive externality would be, it's the 1960s. The Susquehanna River is very polluted. There's a whole line, this is all true, a whole line of manufacturing plants up and down the Susquehanna River. But we find that in many instances, these plants had to take in water. They would use the cool water to cool off some of their machinery, and then they'd return the water to the Susquehanna. Well, what happened in many instances, the water that they would take out of the Susquehanna to cool off some of their own machinery before they put the water back in the Susquehanna, they would take out polluted, dirty water. They would use it, and then they would filter it, and they'd put it back. And when they put it back, the water was cleaner than the water that they took out. So here society is benefiting from having cleaner water and not paying for it. That factory is paying for it. So that is called a positive externality. So we had negative externalities, and here's a positive externality. So they can go both ways. What are the ways to control externalities? Well, we can either tax. We tax a company if they're throwing out too much pollution, for example. So we can tax it, or we can regulate it. We can rule and regulate it and say that they're just not allowed to do that. So that's the only way to take care of negative externalities. We mostly tend to think of negative ones. We can tax it, or we can regulate it. Okay? So those are externalities. Lastly, we want to look at the answer to the question that I posed at the beginning, and that is, When should government intervene in society? Well, as we said before, there are 13 good answers to this when we could intervene in the affairs of society. Actually, I'm wrong. Excuse me. I'm going to give you 7 good instances where we find that the answer to this school was ultimately provided by the British School of Welfare Economics. Now, some may think it's a perfect answer, some may not, but at least it gives you a place to start. What are the 7 instances where government should intervene in the affairs of society? Well, the British School of Welfare Economics tells us number 1 would be consumer ignorance. When something like thalidomide is developed. Thalidomide was a pregnancy drug for women in the 1950s, and we find it did get women pregnant, but it also resulted in many birth defects for the children. So once we discovered that, then it's only right for government to intervene, for government to announce to the people that do not take thalidomide because of the possible birth defects. Another instance where it's all right for government to get involved is, for example, dealing with externalities. If we want to get rid of those negative externalities, again, we should have government be involved with regulation or taxation. So government can intervene when there's consumer ignorance. Government should intervene when there's externalities. How about when we need public goods? Government has to provide them. How about when we have the immobility of factors of production? In some instances, well, I'll tell you what, let me cover that last. We have externalities, we have public goods. How about the redistribution of societal resources? In some instances, we find that, in El Salvador, you have something like 90% of all the land being owned by less than 10% of the people. I don't want to sound socialistic or Marxist here at all. I certainly am anything but that. But you find that in a case like that, it's ripe for revolution, and so you may look to try to redistribute some resources so that that area is not going to be ripe for a revolution, that the government isn't going to be ultimately overthrown very quickly because of that. So the redistribution of resources would be another instance where maybe government should be involved. We find that government might also want to be involved, as we said, for the protection of some vulnerable population segment. The very, very old, the very, very young, very old, very young, or the physically or psychologically, mentally handicapped would be another example of where government should be involved. Consumer ignorance, one other instance would be monopoly. Government should be involved where there has to be a monopoly. We have, for example, monopolies necessary in the area, for example, of public utilities. So we have the Pennsylvania Public Utilities Commission to deal with that. So it's done properly and doesn't favor one business over the other. Consumer ignorance, monopoly, redistribution of resources, protection of vulnerable population segments, public goods, externalities, and lastly, the immobility of the means of production. Well, of course, we know that factors of production are what? Land, labor, and capital. Well, let's say land, labor, and capital. Labor. Let's say this is why we have the unemployment compensation run by the government. If one of you loses your job, You have had traditionally up to a year on unemployment, and that unemployment money was given to you so that you could be retrained if you wanted to be for another job, or you could move to another area. The fact of the matter is that labor, we tend to think that someone's fired, they can just pack up and move to another place where there's jobs. It's not true, because they did have a home, they have to sell the home, they would have a spouse perhaps, and the spouse gets a say, and where does she work or he work? You have children that might be in school, so you need that extra time and that money to prepare for transfer or relocation to another area. So the immobility factors of production, you have land, labor. So we had labor, and we had capital. The last would be land. Land. The immobility factors of production. Land. Obviously, land isn't mobile. One of the best examples of why government had to come in to deal with this issue of the immobility of land could be seen on Route 61, north of Frackville, Pennsylvania. Of course, I'm referring to that little community of Centralia. Centralia once was a community that was almost like Mount Joy here in Lancaster County. It was a nice-sized town, a thriving town, but coal was the major industry there, and the coal mines, as we turned more and more to natural gas, coal as a heating source for our homes started to diminish, and the coal mines were closing, and people started to throw their garbage down abandoned coal mines. Well, in the first half of the 1960s, one of those coal mines with all the garbage in caught fire underneath Centralia. This is the largest seam of anthracite coal in the world, running between Shamokin and Hazleton. Shamokin on the Susquehanna River, and Hazleton in the on the Delaware. You find that this coal mine caught on fire. The seam of coal is on fire. Local authorities tried to put it out and couldn't. State authorities tried to put it out and couldn't. So next we go to Washington, D.C., and the U.S. Department of Interior came and took a look of it. They took a look at it, and they couldn't deal with it easily either. They said they would have to dig a trench, a hole that would be deeper than the Empire State Building was high. So they chose not to do anything about it, and rather than dig that trench, they decided to, land isn't mobile, so government will come in and will buy all the houses of everyone. So they gave everyone more than their house was worth, and people took the settlements and fled to the four corners of the world. Find that there's still just a handful of people that still live there and refuse to accept the settlement, and they've stayed. But here's another instance where, yes, land is not very mobile, and so government came in and helped take care of this problem. So the immobility of the factors of production. This would be another possible area where government might want to be involved in the affairs of us and the day-to-day world. So the principles of microeconomics, I think this pretty much ties it together, and we can move ahead to what is public administration? What is public administration, and how do we approach it? Okay, I'll be back with that in the next video.